Hi everyone, welcome back to the Property Finance Podcast, and today is episode 2 of our sort of 5-part series on development finance. So episode 1 was kind of your complete beginner introduction to development finance. Part 2 is going to be more around understanding the numbers and kind of that initial prep that you can do to check over your deal, check over the numbers. So in terms of a couple of points that we raised in the last one as kind of needing follow-up were talking around kind of the parameters and leverage that you can get to. And then the second one is talking about drawdowns and kind of how they work. So first point about leverage is that most development lenders will go up to 65% loan to GDV. So that's loan to gross development value. So that's what something is worth when it's finished, when the development is complete. So that's your gross development value. They'll normally go up to 65% of that. They will also normally go up to 85-90% loan to cost. Now, loan to cost is a bit of a tricky parameter because each lender looks at it slightly differently. So loan to cost should be loan to your true cost. So that is your purchase price, your build, your professional fees, your true cost of that development. Where some lenders get quite awkward, if you like, is they'll throw their interest into that as well. Obviously, what that does is that drops down the amount that you get day one because they've factored in an additional cost to that. So your loan to cost parameters are blown out of the water. What will happen is they will either go to 65% loan to GDV or 85% loan to cost, whichever is the lower. What tends to happen is you'll hit one of these pretty early. So one of them will normally outweigh the other quite significantly. So you'll hit one pretty obviously quite quickly. They're the parameters straight off for sort of senior debt. If you go to stretch senior debt, you could push up to 70% loan to GDV and 90% loan to cost, again, whichever one is lower. What then happens is you can layer in things like mezzanine finance, which comes in on a second charge. So your senior debt or your stretch senior debt will take that first charge position. And then what will happen is the mezzanine finance will come in on a second charge. And what we'll do is in the next episode, we'll kind of cover off securities, first charge, second charge, personal guarantees, debentures. So what will happen is that mezz will come in as second charge. You've then got potentially equity above that. As well that might come in if you're doing peer-to-peer, etc. That there may be an equity position that comes in there as well. So that's kind of how each one's laid out in terms of leverage. Then we come to drawdowns. So this is the bit that is going to trip up most developers. So what happens is if you're going for development finance and let's say your bill costs are 500 grand, just for argument's sake, you will create a drawdown schedule with your builder, your contractor, whereby they will say, right, just for really round numbers, right, we need 100 grand a month for 5 months. So you'd go to the development lender, you'd say, right, I'm going to be drawing 5 lots of £100,000 at the end of each month. They can then use that to calculate interest, everything else. Where the trip up comes in is that those funds are released in arrears. So those tranches are released against works done or materials bought. And those materials bought, not every lender is going to lend against materials bought. They may decide that, well, actually, it needs to be installed materials. So that's a really important point that you need to check because are they going to release against installed materials or are they going to release against materials that have been bought, stored and insured? And that's a really important bit there is that materials have to be stored securely and insured properly. And most lenders will have that as a parameter. So you need to know at what point they're going to release those. And what will happen is you will have a quantity surveyor who is instructed by the lender and they will come out each time you want a drawdown. They will come and they will basically come to site and they'll say, right, okay, you've spent X amount on materials, you've spent X amount on work, right? Yeah, I can see the invoices. Yep, that's been done, that's been done, that's been done. Great, I'll release this amount of money. And that amount of money is normally equal to kind of what you've requested as a drawdown. Where the trip up comes up is, let's say your contractor says, right, I'm going to pour the foundations, but you need to pay me in advance. Well, those foundations could cost you 50 grand. If you then have to cash flow that 50 grand out your own pocket and then you can't claim it back until the work is done, you could have a period of a week, 2 weeks potentially, whereby you're 50 grand out of pocket and it's very difficult to go and find that money potentially. So what you need to do is at the point that you are getting a contractor on board, a builder on board, is work out exactly what their payment terms are. So Are they going to want money in advance, or are they going to, for example, on foundations, I'll use this as the example, are they going to pour the foundations, and then at the point that they are completed and signed off, they're then going to issue you an invoice and you're then going to have 14 days to pay, for example? Well, if that's the case, what you could do is once the foundations are poured, you get the QS to come in, they can see that work has been done. Okay, you haven't paid for it yet, but they can see it's been done. And because it's been done, they can then release the money to pay that invoice. So from your perspective, you're then able to cash flow that via the lender as opposed to out your own pocket. And it's the same with materials. If your builder has got 30-day credit terms with MKM or Jewsons or Howdens or whoever else they might use, what will happen is they'll go get the materials. They've then got 30 days to pay for those materials. So what happens is they get the materials in, they're then on site, secured, insured, etc. You can then obviously have the QS come out, check that, and then raise the money to pay those materials off within the time period that your builder needs you to. So these are things that you need to get used to asking contractors and builders. What are their payment terms? How do they need to be paid? Because the other thing as well is if they want a deposit for the works, which a lot of builders seem to be moving away from that now. But again, if it's your first project with them, they may want a deposit. If they want a deposit, again, you're going to have to cash flow that out of your own money, which could be a big problem if that deposit is quite significant. I mean, if you're doing £1 million worth of development costs and they want a 200 grand deposit, that is a significant amount of capital to find up front. So you need to be aware of that as well. You can play the position of contractor. So as well as being the developer, so the difference between developer and contractor is the developer is the overarching kind of entity, if you like. The contractor is then essentially the builder, and then the subcontractors are essentially the ones that work under the contractor or the builder to deliver each of the individual trades. You can take on the position of developer and contractor and then hire subcontractors in individually. That obviously is going to save cost. We will cover off in a later episode about how QSs view that, the pros and cons of doing that. It may not be the right solution for your first development, but once you've got a few under your belt and you understand what you're doing and you've got the team around you, potentially that is a sensible way of doing it, because then you're in control of the cash flow to more of a degree, because then you are taking out the trade accounts with MKM, Jewsons, Howdens, whatever, and getting the 30-day, 60-day. You can then go and buy your own materials, and essentially there's no markup on that or anything like that because you're out doing your own procurement. And having done some procurement myself as well personally, it's a hell of a lot easier when you're in control of that yourself as well. So it's quite a nice position to be in. So that's something to bear in mind for the future. Now, the main purpose of this podcast, so this episode, so we've covered off a couple of bits that sort of we mentioned previously. This one is talking all about kind of knowing your numbers. So this is talking about feasibility studies. So we did a whole episode previously around feasibility studies, why they're useful, why they're used, etc. But I just want to cover it off again now because, I mean, we're nearly 200 episodes into this podcast now. It's very difficult sometimes to go back and listen to the same thing. And I think it's always helpful if people pick this podcast up now. They don't want to be listening to 180, 190 episodes to kind of catch up. So it's always nice to have a bit of a recap. So feasibility studies, this is talking about essentially that initial appraisal that you're doing of the deal. So you've gone off, you've checked your GDVs, you've checked your build costs. You're at a point where you're like, right, okay, I've put some time into this. It's time to kind of really check out the feasibility of this project. So there's two levels of feasibility study that you could do. There's your own. So for example, if you're part of any mentorships, you've probably got deal analyzers that they've put together. So we've been part of ones where they've had like IDAs, where essentially they do the bit again. So if you're part of a mentorship or anything like that, chances are you've got a deal analyzer that they've given you. And what will happen is it's that initial feasibility study, which doesn't really require any professional input, if you know what I mean. So you're plugging in your GDVs that you found off Rightmove, you're plugging in your build costs from BCIS or wherever you've pulled your build costs from. You're plugging in your professional fees from whatever your mentor said to you, 1%, whatever. That gives you a very top level feasibility study of, does this project actually look like it's worth any more time? So that spreadsheet, and we've got template spreadsheets that we're happy to sort of send out to people. But that initial spreadsheet is, yes, this is worth more time. Yes, this is worth putting a bit of money into. Yes, this is worth kind of analysing to the next step. So once you've filled in that spreadsheet, you've got your GDVs, etc., you've done your right move appraisals, bill costs, everything else. You then go to probably a high-level QS. So you go to a QS and you say, right, I need you to have a look over these costs for me. So the big one, obviously they're going to be checking over is the bill costs. So they're going to go through the bill costs with a fine-tooth comb. They're inevitably going to push those bill costs higher because that's what QSs do. So at that point, you kind of lose the contingencies that you'd built in your spreadsheet, but you then have a more accurate bill costs. So immediately, you know, right, are these bill costs feasible or not? The other thing that does as well is that when you're going to tender, that gives you an idea of where the bill cost should be. So if anyone's wildly above that, you know that it's probably not worth pursuing. If anyone's wildly below that, you know it's probably unachievable. The second bit you then do is you probably want to approach 3 estate agents, I would say minimum. So you go to 3 estate agents and you ask them for the GDV of the project. And what you then do is you take an average of those 3. Now, if any of them are wildly different, if you have 3 completely conflicting results, then what I would say is probably add in a 4th or a 5th, depending on where you are and how many estate agents are local. But minimum 3. You need to have that sort of variety across the board that you can sort of pick on and take the average of. So that's where you'll get your sort of GDV from. So that's the next level of feasibility study on your GDV. So you've checked out your GDV, you've checked out your build costs. Then it's a case of professional fees. Very easy to do. You just go to each of the professionals and get a quote. So that shouldn't take too much time. You've got your architect, your planning consultant, your solicitor, your broker, all of those. You can do that pretty quickly. Then it's the feasibility of your financing costs. So this is where you would come to us. We would sit down with you and we would say, right, the interest cost is probably going to be this. Arrangement fees are probably going to be this. Exit fees are going to be this. Day one amount's going to be this, etc. We can start to build up the funding stack for you and get an overall idea of those financing costs. Once you've got that, you then have a pretty accurate GDV. You then have a pretty accurate bill cost, a pretty accurate finance cost, and a pretty accurate professional fee breakdown. So what started off as a spreadsheet that was filled with right-move numbers, BCIS numbers, everything else, you're going to find that these numbers are wildly different, that there's going to be some serious drilling down of numbers. But what this second spreadsheet does is it tells you, right, okay, is this now worth putting my hand in my pocket for? So this first spreadsheet, that tells you whether it's worth spending time on. This second spreadsheet tells you whether it's worth spending money on. And this second spreadsheet, this proper feasibility study, that's where you're going to know whether you're within your loan to GDV parameters, whether you're within your loan to cost parameters, and it's going to give you an idea of where you sit. Now, this second spreadsheet that you're doing, there's also going to be some risk analysis done within this as well. So a big part of the feasibility study is not only making sure the numbers stack up, but it's also about making sure that the numbers stack up in 18 months' time. Do the numbers still stack up if the market drops 10%? Do the numbers still stack up if the market increases 10%? So what you would do is you would have essentially a series of scenarios. So here are the numbers if the GDV is 10% lower. Here is the numbers if the GDV is 10% higher. Here are the numbers if the bill costs are 10% lower. Here are the numbers if the bill costs are 10% higher, which, I mean, we've seen bill costs go up a fair bit, so I don't think that's unreasonable. You may even push that as high as 20%, depending on kind of how you want to work it. So bill cost inflation is a real risk, and obviously QSs will try and cover that off. Part of the bill costs analysis that the QS does, so when they do their kind of feasibility coverage of it and kind of what you're paying for there, is actually they will factor inflation in within their numbers. So they will sort of work out the bill cost, they'll work out the bill cost drawdown schedule, and they will be able to apply inflation to that as well. So what you're doing by adding another 10% here is actually overinflating inflated numbers, but it all builds in contingency. The other thing you need to think as well, in terms of doing your number risk analysis, you also need to think scenario risk analysis. So you need to think, well, what if planning is refused? What do I do then? If you've already bought the site, how do you then dispose of it? If you're on an option agreement, how much have you spent, X, Y, Z? So you need to think about things like that as well, because again, planning for refusals can be pretty costly. So once you've got all of that, you've got a pretty good idea of where your numbers are at. And lenders want to see this as well. And I think this is a really good exercise to do. Now, obviously, moving from that indicative spreadsheet to a full-blown feasibility statement, there are costs involved with going to the QS, for example. You need to weigh that up. Obviously, paying £500 every time you look at a deal isn't going to be financially viable, because most developers are looking at probably 10 to 20 deals a month. Well, if all of a sudden you've got to pay out 5-10 grand a month in QS fees, I mean, talking personally, that isn't sustainable for us. We wouldn't do that. So I don't know many people who would have that kind of money just to look over deals. So you need to really cherry pick those deals that you are going to take to that next level. And obviously, once you build a relationship with the QS, obviously it is going to get cheaper as you do more and more, obviously. But it is worth keeping in mind that there is a cost involved from going from indicative numbers to proper drilled down numbers. The other thing as well is that obviously there's going to be a cost for them to assist you with the tendering process as well. So you need to keep that in mind as well. But lenders want to see this. When they look at a deal, they want to know that you know your numbers. What we drill down into with clients is sending us that initial spreadsheet is great, fantastic. We can use that to go to lenders and get some indicative finance terms. But if you want proper, full-blown agreement in principles, decision in principles, if you want to know exactly what your financing costs are going to be, we need this feasibility statement. And the other important thing within this feasibility statement, as I mentioned a moment ago, is the QS is going to do that drawdown schedule. So we will have an idea pretty quickly of when you need the money and at what stages, and that allows an interest calculation to be done, which is more accurate than just, I need £1 million over 12 months. That's very difficult to work out the interest on that, because one key point with development finance is that interest is only ever charged on the money that you've drawn down. So what you need to keep in mind is that if you're drawing most of your development finance at the front end, which naturally you would do, you're obviously going to pay more interest than if you draw it sort of in equal chunks over the time period, or if it's more back-ended. So you have to keep that in mind as part of your drawdown schedule as well. So lenders want to see this. It is helpful. Please try and do it as much as you can. Obviously, I'm not suggesting, like I said, to go and spend £500 on every single deal you do, but you should have a pretty good idea of how to transition from one to the other. And like I said, this initial spreadsheet allows you to work out whether the deal is worth your time. This second one is whether it's worth money and whether it's worth investing in proper professional fees rather than just 500 quid, whether it's worth spending out thousands of pounds on valuations, solicitor fees, QS fees, everything else. So that second spreadsheet, that proper feasibility statement is really, really important, and doing that risk analysis across it as well. Hopefully that's been helpful. Like I said in the previous episode, hopefully this is helpful for both if you are a complete newbie to development or if you've done developments previously. Hopefully this is sort of providing some value across the board. But otherwise, thank you very much for watching, and I will catch you on the next one.